The day an HOA called the sheriff on me for camping beside my own lake, I honestly thought it was some kind of misunderstanding. Then I found out they'd been making money off my property for almost a decade, and suddenly that little misunderstanding turned into the biggest legal fight of my life. My name is Ethan Walker. I'm 36 years old, and until 2 years ago, I was just a civil engineer living outside Albuquerque, trying to keep up with work deadlines, mortgage payments, and all the normal adult stuff nobody warns you about when you're young. Then my grandfather passed away. Grandpa Roy was one of those old-school Western guys who never trusted banks, hated paperwork, and somehow still managed to build something meaningful. Most people in town knew him as the stubborn rancher who could repair anything with a wrench and bad language. What most people didn't know was that he owned a massive stretch of land out near the Arizona-New Mexico border, land that had been in our family for generations. When the estate was settled, I inherited nearly 900 acres, including a 40-acre spring-fed lake that sat right in the middle of the property. I hadn't spent much time there growing up. Grandpa liked his privacy and usually visited alone, but I remembered fishing there when I was a kid, sitting beside him while he told stories that probably weren't true. After he passed, I promised myself I'd spend more time on the land. So the following summer, I loaded up my truck, packed a tent, grabbed some food, and headed out for what I thought would be a quiet weekend. The drive took almost 4 hours. The farther I got from the city, the more relaxed I felt. Cell service disappeared. Traffic vanished. It was just open sky, dirt roads, and memories. Then I reached the entrance road leading toward the lake, and that's where things got weird. There was a sign I had never seen before. It was mounted on a brand new post and looked professionally made. At the top, it said Community Recreation Area. Underneath that, in large letters, it said Fishing Permit Required. Daily access, $8. I remember sitting in my truck staring at it for a solid minute. I actually laughed because I thought somebody was playing a joke. $8 to fish in my lake. That was funny, at least for about 10 seconds. Then I noticed fresh gravel in the parking area. There were several vehicles parked nearby. Families were unloading fishing gear. Kids were running around. Somebody had installed trash cans and picnic tables. The place looked like a county park. My county park. I got out and walked around trying to understand what I was seeing. Nobody seemed suspicious. Nobody looked like they were trespassing. In fact, everyone acted like they belonged there. One older guy carrying a tackle box even smiled at me and said, "Beautiful day for fishing, huh?" I smiled back and said, "Apparently." Then I drove down to the shoreline and started setting up my tent. I figured I'd call the county office Monday and sort out whatever bureaucratic mess had happened. I wasn't angry yet, mostly confused. Looking back, that confusion lasted about 20 minutes. That's how long it took for a white SUV with a neighborhood patrol logo on the side to come bouncing down the access road. The driver parked beside my truck and stepped out. He wore a polo shirt with a badge stitched onto it and carried himself like he was the sheriff of his own little kingdom. He walked over and glanced at my tent. "Sir, camping isn't allowed at the community lake." I thought maybe he was joking. "Community lake?" I asked. "Yeah," he said. "Residents only after sunset. You'll need to pack up." I looked at him for a second. "I own this property." He laughed. Actually laughed. "No, sir. This lake is managed by Cedar Ridge Estates." "That's interesting," I said, "because my name is on the deed." His smile disappeared. He pulled out a radio. "Stay right here." I remember standing there watching him make calls while this strange feeling started growing in my stomach. Not fear exactly. More like the feeling you get when you realize a story you've been told doesn't quite add up. 30 minutes later, 2 sheriff's deputies arrived. By then, several fishermen had gathered nearby to watch. The HOA patrol guy immediately started talking. He told the deputies I was trespassing on protected recreation land and refusing to leave. One deputy walked over and asked for identification. I handed him my driver's license and then reached into my truck for a folder containing copies of the property records. He looked at the documents. Then he looked at me. Then back at the documents. The other deputy stepped away and made a phone call. 10 minutes later, he returned wearing the kind of expression cops get when they realize their day just became complicated. That's when he said something I'll never forget. "Sir, according to county records, This lake has been operating under a recreational access permit since 2018. My stomach dropped, because I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Neither I nor my grandfather had ever signed anything like that. The deputy wasn't accusing me of anything. If anything, he sounded confused. But confusion wasn't exactly comforting when somebody was standing on your property, telling you the government had paperwork saying your lake belonged to the public. I remember asking him the same question 3 different ways because I thought maybe I wasn't hearing him correctly. Who signed it? He shrugged. I don't know. Who applied for it? Another shrug. County records would have that. Then he handed my paperwork back and said something that stuck with me. If these documents are accurate, you need a lawyer. That's never a sentence anybody wants to hear. The deputies eventually left. The HOA patrol guy didn't say much after that. He just climbed back into his SUV and drove away. But before he left, he gave me this smug little smile that bothered me more than anything else. It was the smile of someone who thought the system was already on his side. I didn't sleep much that night. I sat beside the lake watching the moon reflect across the water and thinking about my grandfather. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. Roy Walker had fought lawsuits, droughts, wildfires, and developers trying to buy his land. There was no universe where that man voluntarily handed over control of his lake to an HOA. The next morning, I drove straight back home and started making calls. Within 48 hours, I hired an attorney named Laura Bennett. Laura was one of those lawyers who didn't waste words. I handed her everything I had and explained the situation. She listened quietly for 20 minutes, flipped through the documents, then leaned back in her chair. Something smells very bad here. That's what I was afraid of. She nodded. Let's find out how bad. The first thing we did was request copies of every permit, application, survey, and supporting document connected to the recreational access agreement. A week later, we got them. I still remember sitting in Laura's office when she slid the application across her desk. There was a signature authorizing public access to the lake. The problem was simple. It wasn't mine. It wasn't my grandfather's either. We compared against estate records, tax records, property transfers, even old letters Grandpa had written. Nothing matched. Whoever signed that document wasn't connected to my family at all. Laura stared at the page for a long moment. Congratulations, she said. You officially have a fraud case. That's when the entire situation changed. Up until then, I thought I was dealing with some bureaucratic mistake. Maybe somebody filed the wrong paperwork. Maybe county records got mixed up. But forged signatures don't happen by accident. Somebody made a decision. Somebody knowingly signed documents they had no right to sign. Somebody spent years making money from that decision. And suddenly I wanted names. Laura filed an emergency injunction immediately. At the same time, I decided I was done being polite. The access road crossed entirely through my property. There was no legal easement, no public right-of-way, no special access agreement. So I hired a contractor. 3 days later, we installed a massive steel gate across the entrance. Not one of those decorative ranch gates, either. I'm talking about 16 feet of steel reinforced with concrete barriers sunk deep into the ground. Then I removed every sign claiming the lake was public and replaced them with new ones. Private property. No trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted. The reaction was immediate. By Saturday morning, a line of vehicles had formed outside the gate. People were confused. Some were angry. Others genuinely thought there had been a mistake. One elderly couple approached me while I was working near the entrance. The husband looked frustrated, but not hostile. We've been fishing here for 7 years. I nodded. I believe you. We paid for permits. I believe that too. His wife frowned. Then why are you closing it? I pointed toward the lake. Because it belongs to me. They exchanged glances. The husband sighed. Nobody ever told us that. And honestly, that was the first moment I realized how many people had been lied to. Most of the residents weren't villains. They weren't stealing. They had simply trusted what their HOA told them. The real problem sat at the top. 2 days later, I got my first phone call from the president of Cedar Ridge Estates. His name was Martin Graves. Even now, years later, I can still hear that guy yelling through my phone. He didn't introduce himself, didn't say hello, just launched directly into a rant. Do you have any idea what you've done? I pulled the phone away from my ear. Good afternoon to you too. 300 families pay dues expecting access to that lake. Interesting. You can't just shut it down. Actually, I can. More yelling. A lot more yelling. Finally, I got tired of listening. Martin, let me ask you something. What? Who signed the permit? Silence. Not long. Maybe 3 seconds. But long enough. Then he replied, I don't know what you're talking about. Sure you don't. Click. He hung up. That silence bothered me. Innocent people usually deny accusations immediately. Guilty people calculate first. Over the next several weeks, Laura began digging deeper. She subpoenaed HOA financial records. That's when the numbers started appearing. Every year since the permit was filed, the HOA collected access fees, permit fees, recreation fees, parking fees, and special assessment fees tied directly to the lake. We built spreadsheets, then bigger spreadsheets, then even bigger spreadsheets. The final total nearly made me fall out of my chair. They had collected more than $300,000 over 8 years. $300,000 generated from property they didn't own. Property they had no legal right to manage. Property they only controlled because somebody forged documents. Laura looked at the report and slowly shook her head. This just became a lot bigger. It got worse. We discovered county agencies had spent taxpayer money maintaining a lake. Fish stocking programs, habitat modifications, vegetation removal projects, invasive species management. Thousands upon thousands of dollars had gone into a body of water officials believed was operating under a legitimate agreement. Except it wasn't legitimate. Some of those environmental changes had actually disrupted parts of the ecosystem my grandfather spent decades protecting. I remember walking along the shoreline one evening, looking at areas that had been altered and feeling something I hadn't expected. Sadness. The money mattered, sure. The fraud mattered. But this place carried memories. I could still picture Grandpa sitting under a cottonwood tree, cleaning fish. I could hear his voice. Every unauthorized change felt personal, like somebody had slowly erased pieces of him while nobody was paying attention. That's when I stopped thinking about settlements. I stopped thinking about compromise. I wanted accountability. Real accountability. Laura agreed. She packaged everything we had gathered and forwarded the evidence to the state attorney general's office. The forged signatures, the financial records, the county permits, the revenue reports, the discrepancies, the witness statements, everything. Then we waited. Waiting turned out to be the hardest part. Weeks passed. Rumors spread through Cedar Ridge estates. Residents began asking questions. Some demanded answers from the HOA board. Others accused me of overreacting. One local Facebook group turned into complete chaos. Half the neighborhood claimed I was greedy. The other half wanted the board investigated immediately. Every day seemed to bring a new rumor. Then one morning Laura called. I could tell from her voice before she even spoke. Something had happened. The attorney general opened an investigation. I sat there quietly for a moment. Officially, criminal, potentially. For the first time since this nightmare started, I felt the balance shift. Not because I had won, not yet, but because the people responsible could no longer hide behind paperwork and meetings and official titles. Someone was finally looking under the hood. And from everything we'd uncovered so far, I had a feeling they weren't going to like what they found. The investigation moved a lot faster than I expected. Looking back, I think that's because the evidence was already sitting there waiting for someone to connect the dots. Once state investigators started pulling records, things unraveled quickly. People who had been very confident suddenly became very nervous. People who had spent years talking loudly at HOA meetings suddenly stopped answering questions. And the man who had screamed at me on the phone, Martin Graves, seemed to disappear every time reporters showed up. About a month after the investigation officially began, Laura called me again. This time she sounded almost amused. You sitting down? She asked. Should I be? Probably. Then she told me county officials had concluded the permit application contained false information and unauthorized signatures. The HOA was being hit with major penalties, and investigators were recommending criminal charges against several board members involved in the original filing. I remember staring out my office window for a long time after that call ended. Not because I was celebrating. Honestly, I mostly felt relief. For months, I'd lived inside this story. Every day was another document, another phone call, another argument, another accusation. Now, for the first time, reality was finally catching up to the people who created the mess. The public fallout was brutal. Residents who had trusted the board wanted answers. Local newspapers started covering the story. Community meetings turned into shouting matches. One former board member actually tried blaming county officials. County officials blamed the board. Everybody seemed eager to point fingers at everybody else. But documents don't care about excuses. Records don't care about opinions. Eventually, the facts won. The HOA agreed to a financial settlement that included repayment of the revenue generated from the lake, accumulated interest, and additional costs connected to the legal battle. By the time everything was finalized, the amount exceeded $300,000. A few months later, the funds arrived. I won't pretend it wasn't satisfying. It was. But the most satisfying moment wasn't seeing the money. It happened a week later. I was driving through town when I stopped at a gas station. An older man recognized me from the news coverage. He walked over and shook my hand. "Your grandfather would be proud." That's it. One sentence. Yet somehow it meant more than every legal victory combined. Because deep down, this was never just about money. It was about protecting something my family built. It was about refusing to let somebody rewrite reality because they thought nobody would challenge them. Not long after the settlement, Martin resigned from the HOA board. 2 other board members followed. Some residents wanted harsher consequences. Others argued people should move on. To this day, you'll still find folks who disagree about how everything played out. That's small-town life. Everybody has an opinion. Then came the twist nobody expected. A few months after the case ended, county officials reached out to me directly. This time, there were no forged documents, no secret agreements, no arrangements, just an honest proposal. They wanted to discuss a legitimate lease agreement for recreational access to the lake. At first, I laughed. After everything that happened, the idea sounded ridiculous. But the more we talked, the more it made sense. The county would handle maintenance. They would manage access. They would cover operational costs. And in exchange, the property would generate annual income while remaining legally protected. Laura reviewed every word. And she reviewed it again. And then, because she was Laura, she reviewed it one more time. Eventually, we agreed to terms. The contract included one condition I refused to compromise on. If any part of the agreement was violated, I could terminate it immediately. No loopholes, no dilas, no debates. County officials accepted the condition without argument. Maybe they had learned something from the previous disaster. Maybe I had too. The following summer, I returned to the lake. Not for court hearings, not for inspections, not for meetings, just for camping. I parked my truck near the shoreline, set up my old tent, unfolded a weathered camping chair, and sat beside the water as the sun disappeared behind the hills. Everything felt different, not because the land had changed. The lake looked the same. The trees were the same. The breeze moving across the water sounded the same. What changed was the feeling. The constant tension was gone. The uncertainty was gone. For the first time since inheriting the property, I could simply enjoy being there. As darkness settled across the lake, I found myself thinking about Grandpa again. I imagined him looking at the whole ridiculous situation and shaking his head, then probably laughing. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that some people see an unattended piece of property and think opportunity. Some people see paperwork and assume nobody will verify it. Some people convince themselves that if a lie survives long enough, it somehow becomes the truth. But every now and then they run into someone stubborn enough to start asking questions. The gate still stands at the entrance road today. The lock still clicks shut every evening. And every summer I spend at least one weekend camping beside that lake. Nobody tells me to leave anymore. Nobody claims it's community property. Nobody calls the sheriff. The strange thing is, I don't even think about the money much these days. What I remember most is that first afternoon when a man looked me straight in the eye and told me I wasn't allowed to camp on my own land. If someone had told me then how the story would end, I probably wouldn't have believed them. But maybe that's why these situations matter. Sometimes standing your ground isn't about winning. It's about refusing to surrender the truth when everyone around you insists on believing a lie. Now I'm curious what you think. If you discovered an organization had been profiting from your property for years using documents you never signed, would you have shut everything down immediately, or would you have tried to work out a compromise first? And do you think the people responsible got what they deserved, or should the consequences have been even harsher? Let me know down in the comments, because stories like this always spark strong opinions, and honestly, that's what makes these conversations worth having.